הם רוצים להתחיל בשמונה עגולות?
yes.
יכול להיות. כן, כי תסתכל, גדל גם מספר אנשים שצופים, יש כבר 26.
כן.
מה זה מפגש?
זה מפגש במחלקה שם בסן דייגו אוניברסיטי.
שאתה לא איך אתה הולך להיות אורח שלך?
כן.
כל אחד מספר על הקורסים?
לא, על דיון על מה שקורה באזור, מה שכזה.
המיקרופון נדלק, אתה רואה? ואז יש את הצהוב הזה. כשיש צהוב, אז מי שמדבר זה הצהוב. הוא מוגדר בפריים. אם למשל הוא ידבר, אתה תראה שהצהוב הזה
Hello, everybody.
If all speakers would like to unmute themselves, we will get started. Susan, you're good to go.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the over 100 people registered for this event and on the call. I'm Susan Lapidus, Director of the Murray Gallinson San Diego Israel Initiative, MGSDII. Our mission is to bring Israel studies to San Diego universities and our community through academic discourse, as well as build collaborations and relationships between students and professors in San Diego and Israel. We're very happy to be partnering today with San Diego University Jewish Studies, led by Risa Levitt. A special welcome to all of the professors and students on the call from SDSU, UCSD, USD, and Cal State San Marcos. So today, I'm particularly proud to bring you this esteemed panel of Israeli scholars on international relations and politics to share their expertise on Thursday's announcement of a peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It's not often that we get to hear from such prestigious academics on the ground. Thank you, professors, and we hope to be able to host you in San Diego post-corona. Before I introduce our panelists, a little housekeeping. Each of the professors will do a 5-minute opening talk. Following that, they will have a discussion. At that time, we will take questions from the audience that you can post via the chat feature. Please indicate if you'd like a particular professor to answer your question. Now I'm honored to introduce our scholars in the order of when they will speak. In the interest of time, the introductions will be brief, though each of our professors has a bio a mile long. Professors, please add anything that I might have missed that you'd like to share when you speak. Okay, so Yossi Shane is the head of Tel Aviv University's School of Political Science, Government, and International Affairs, and Professor Emeritus of Government at Georgetown University. Meir Litvak is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv University and former Director of the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. Uzi Rabi is the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies and a senior researcher at the Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. He is also a former visiting scholar at San Diego State University. Tamar Areli is a senior lecturer at Tel Hai College in Northern Israel and also a former MGSDII visiting scholar at San Diego State University. Her work focuses on border regions and the potential of cross-border cooperation between neighboring communities. Yossi, would you like to start? Oh, you need to unmute.
I guess I'm okay now. So thank you so much, Susan, for hosting us. And I'm delighted to see my friends here from Tel Aviv University and Tamar. The occasion, I guess, for the talk or for the session is the new initiative in the Middle East, the UAE initiative, American-Israeli sort of new peace deal that is being discussed. It is a dramatic development in the Middle East whenever there is another Arab country entering the circle of countries that are having peace or are about to have a deal, a mutual recognition and a peace with the State of Israel. This is, of course, long in the making, but nevertheless, it is a very happy moment for anyone who is interested in enlarging the circle of those who are living side by side with Israel in peace. My friends here, both of whom are experts in Middle East affairs, will speak, I assume, on the regional dimensions of this deal. There's a lot of things to be said about it. First of all, and I'm sure both of them will agree, that we are somewhat dealing with the tactic that everybody is adopting in the Middle East right now, is not focusing on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but rather focusing on the Arab-Israeli conflict as the conflict began early on, enlarging the circle of Arabs and eventually, hopefully, resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This means that the Palestinians, who have been all kind of like waiting, always making the claim that the Arabs will support them, etc., are now finding themselves more and more outside the circle of those who are living side by side in peace with Israel and no longer defended, quote unquote, by the Arab umbrella, perhaps even the Muslim umbrella in the region. The developments here are coming on the hill of many changes that took place in the Middle East, including, of course, the failure of the Arab Spring or what happened after that, the rupture in the Arab world and the Muslim world between Shiite and Sunnis, the position of the Iranians in the region, and the rise of Israel in its stature and its position in the region. I don't want to talk about all of this because this is, of course, an issue we're going to discuss, and I have 5 minutes. I probably have only left 3. The things which are also in conjunction with this development are development inside Israel and inside the United States. This is a geopolitical matter rather than any dramatic peace deal of kind of like after war, because we never had any war with the UAE. What we have is an American election coming in November, with President Trump has to decide sort of like what he adopts as his legacy coming to the election in terms of the Middle East. And of course, Netanyahu himself, who finds himself in some trouble in Israel because of charges of corruption that has to come to the court in January, and a very weak coalition. And all of this amidst the coronavirus, which also has to be taken into consideration. So let me say just a few words about all these components that bring this moment at this time, because it is not at all clear why is it at this time. It could have been done before, it could have been done later, etc. One thing is that this deal was also, and people forget, has kind of a caveat, or at least an issue, which is the issue of annexation. For many, many months, Prime Minister Netanyahu made the point that he is about to annex parts of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, issues that are long-standing issue in the debate. And this comes on the hill of the Trump plan for the Middle East. The Trump plan for the Middle East, which worked out by Mr. Kushner and others, was all about the idea that there will be a new arrangement in the Middle East in which Israel will annex about 30% of the territory, and on 70% there will be a Palestinian state. Since Palestinian state was not coming to the fore, and the Palestinians, of course, will not agree, the Israelis adopted a certain position saying, we will annex, and let's see what the Palestinians will do next. There was a lot of criticism of this move, both in terms of internal criticism, whether it will help or not in what we're doing. The Trump administration was not clear whether they are interested in that in terms of their elections and in terms of the larger plan for the Middle East, the Kushner plan, so to speak, or the Trump administration plan. And of course, for Netanyahu, once he realized he cannot annex because the pressure was mounting, and the question was mounting because of American politics mainly, when Mr. Biden and the Democrats and others were warning against this annexation and the Europeans were warning Israel, there was kind of like an attempt here to say, okay, let's bypass the issue of annexation, and instead of annexation, we're going to get peace deal, especially since the UAE people also said, if you give up on annexation, we will sign an official peace deal. So you can see there is kind of geopolitics. There is a lot of politics inside. There is domestic politics in Israel, domestic politics in the United States, Middle Eastern politics, yes, and of course, the players are playing a role in this. And all of this is happening amidst this idea that the world itself is in somewhat a mayhem. It is unclear about American governing international affairs in the same matter. There is a lot of issues pertaining to American position in the Middle East and where the Middle East is going in the post-Trump era or the second-term Trump era. People are kind of like it's a very problematic issue. Let alone, of course, the position of the Iranians, what is happening in the border in Lebanon with the Hezbollah, what is happening with the Hamas in the southern part of Israel. What I want to make a point is that things are happening sometimes. Things are coming to fruition. Things are developing, not necessarily in a kind of like a linear fashion. They are coming to the fore when something is ripe. Ripeness here means that something is ripe, but not other things are ripe. They're not ripe in terms of annexation. They're not ripe in terms of moving forward with the Palestinians. There is a ripeness here, Israel and the UAE. There is kind of almost no controversy about these issues. Both countries are eager to have business. Both countries are not, of course, nemesis. There is a strategic alliance between them vis-a-vis the other Arab countries. And there is, of course, tremendous potential here. If the Saudis will come, if Qatar and Bahrain and others will come, this will be an interesting development. I'll shut my mouth in a second, Susan. I have 20 seconds. So in the last 20 seconds, I will say my opening remark, we are celebrating this moment. We're all eager and happy when another Arab country is entering the circle of peace with Israel. This is a very important moment, but one has to take into account all those other elements, because this is one thing in the puzzle which is constantly being built and sometimes being retreated. And sometimes this puzzle is moving into the larger picture of perhaps dwelling along our neighbors in peace. Sometimes something has to give, and some rivalries inside or outside the system. So that's where we are, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Yossi, and we'll hear more from you in a little bit. Meir? Meir, you have to unmute.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this event and for hosting us, and I'm very glad to take part in it. I want to take up a point which Yossi began, but to elaborate, and I will elaborate mainly about the two losers from this development, basically the Palestinians and the Iranians, from the two ends. I think the event, this development, and the normalization between Israel and the UAE is a strategic defeat for the Palestinian national movement, in the sense that the Palestinian national movement in past years, which is found itself in a very deep crisis, from which it cannot, I would say, extricate itself, believed that they held a veto power over the policies of Arab states, that no Arab state, except Egypt and Jordan, for different go forward toward Israel without the Palestinian, you can say, approval, or without any progress on the Palestinian issue toward an independent Palestinian state. That has not happened. Not only it has not happened, but the UAE has broken a taboo that the country is willing to normalize with Israel, not out of economic necessity, not out because it can no longer wage a war against Israel, but because it serves its own interests. And the Palestinians feel that two things have happened. First of all, the Palestinian issue is no longer the number one emotional issue for the Arabs. For years, the Palestinian issue has not been the number one political issue for the Arabs. The Arab countries have for years been much more concerned about Iran, much more concerned about radical Islam, about their own domestic affairs, but emotionally, the Palestinian issue had held a very high place. Now it has declined. Now Arab states can say openly, we care first and foremost about our own interests, less about the Palestinians. Now, the problem is for the Palestinians is that they not only they have lost veto power over the Arabs, but they have lost leverage over Israel in advancing toward their national goals. And also the problem is that this additional crisis or additional challenge is not sufficient to bring about reconciliation in the Palestinian political system itself between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. The continuous split between the West Bank and Gaza is a major problem and disaster for the Palestinians in the long run, which serves, I would say, Israeli interests. Now, there's another problem, is that the Palestinian leadership now is, I would say, a bankrupt leadership. It is unable to pressure Israel. It is unable to bring about really the Arab world behind it. It is losing support and sympathy of its own population. There is growing resentment among the Palestinians vis-a-vis Palestinian Authority and vis-a-vis Hamas. And this weakens the Palestinian leadership even more, and I would say makes it much more difficult from even now to make any progress toward any solution toward Israel, because here I would say something very political. Neither the Israeli leadership nor the Palestinian leadership is willing and powerful enough to make the necessary painful concessions that are needed in order to achieve some sort of a settlement between these two people. I'm not talking about peace, I'm talking about settlement. Now, in the short run, this crisis of the Palestinians serves the Israeli government and serves certain Israeli positions. But here, let me say something again, very political, okay? I'm an Israeli Zionist Jew, okay? And I want to preserve Israel as a Zionist, Jewish, democratic state. The current status quo is not a status quo. It is a dynamic, and may lead us slowly, but unfortunately, I would say almost surely, toward what we may call a one-state solution, which for me, as a Zionist Israeli Jew, is a disaster. It may mean the end of the Zionist dream, which means that in the short run, we may see an Israeli achievement, but in the long run, a status quo or a dead end in Israeli-Palestinian relations does not serve the Israeli long-term interest. Now, this is what I will say about the Palestinians. Let me move for whatever time I've left, and Susan, you can stop me any moment you want. Iran is also a loser because Iran has been trying to build itself as a regional power in the Middle East, as the leader of the Middle East, as I would say almost an hegemon in the Middle East. But Iranian aggressive policies in Iraq, in Syria, etc., has alienated the Arab countries. It has scared Arab countries. Some of the Arab Gulf countries, I don't want to step into Uzi's turf, but I would say some of the Arab Gulf countries see Israel as a potential supporter or ally against Iran. And they are first and foremost guided by their fear of Iran. Now, the Iranians realize it. And you can see the ferocity of Iranian, or the anger or frustration of the Iranians, is not only that they've accused the UAE of being traitors and so on, but a senior Iranian spokesman threatened the Emirati crown prince of the same fate of the late Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who was assassinated. Basically, the Iranians now resort to open, ugly threats of assassinations, of terrorism against Arab countries that try to normalize their relations with Israel. This is a sign or a symptom of the Iranian frustration from the development with the UAE. And let me say here, additional frustration with the Iranians face themselves in countries like Iraq and Lebanon, where the population is increasingly angry at Iranian intervention, which is partly responsible for the horrible economic crisis in both countries. Plus, the inability of, plus the continued clashes between Iran and Israel on Syrian soil. So I would say the development between Israel and the UAE adds one more frustration for the Iranians in the regional policies. Now, should I stop here or do I have more time?
Why don't we stop now, and we'll come back to you during the discussion. Thank you, Mir. Thank you so much. Uzi?
Great. Thanks, Susan and Risa, for making that happen. And this is kind of a great opportunity to see you once again, talk to you in this very important gathering. I'll confine myself to just 3 bullet points, and then we can elaborate on that and discuss. When it comes to this agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, I tend to see here a real drama. And I think that there is a historical, I would say, significance to this agreement for 3 reasons, or 3, let's say, observations I would like actually to make in order to leave behind my ideas about it. First of all, it serves to emphasize the tumultuous change this region has gone through since 1967 to 2020. And what we got here is a fragmentation of the Arab fold. Basically, what the United Arab Emirates is, or stands for, is kind of a different answer to a very old question, which means who the enemy is. In the 20th century, it went without saying who the enemy is. It was Israel. Arab states actually were gathering around those slogans of pan-Arabism, denial of Israel, or refusing to accept the very right existence of Israel. And I think that to a large extent, what we got now is kind of a different Arab diplomacy or even camp. This is only the United Arab Emirates, but to a large extent, actually behind that, you can find Saudi Arabia too. You can find Egypt. Those three states are collaborating and cooperating in Yemen, in Libya. Why? Because they have, I would say, sort of shared interests. They see eye to eye as to who the enemy is. And that actually is reflected in two main threats while talking about Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and the others. The first, as Mayor said, is Iran, of course. And this comes from times immemorial. And this is something which is definitely well entrenched in the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf. The second is Turkey and the Ikhwani, Muslim brothers, Hamas, Qatar, Turkey. I mean, these two currents or ideologies are being considered by those states as kind of a threat to their very survival. I mean, as it happens, I mean, these are basically also the rivals of Israel in the region. So when it comes to the new geopolitical setting, there is kind of a wide common denominator between Israel and these states. And this is what made this possible on the one hand. Second, as Yossi and Meir said, and I fully agree, this served also to show how marginalized the Palestinian issue came to be when it comes to the Arab discourse. It used to be the most instrumental issue in the 20th century. And Arab states actually were taking it as kind of goes without saying. We have to support the Palestinians. We have actually to just, this is kind of a token or kind of a symbol by which you reflect or epitomize your Arabness. Well, it's not there. And what the United Arab Emirates just said yesterday, and let me say that, I mean, I've been there several times. I have some friends in the Emirates, Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And I think that these are, as I call that, and I teach that, different Arabs. It's a different culture. Basically, it is originated from tribal culture. But all these guys that you see, MBZ and others, are fine diplomats that were actually educated in Sandhurst and Cambridge. And they come up with something which is differently new. But what they say is that Palestinians are not going actually to threat us anymore by not doing kind of that cooperation with Israel. There was an equation for 40 years, and many people in Israel actually held it, and all over the world. They say loud and clear, there is no possibility whatsoever to have full normalization for Israel with an Arab state without getting in advance a full and comprehensive agreement with the Palestinians. Once again, they were mistaken. And this is what was proved yesterday or the day before. It's a new Arab diplomacy, which is based on state-based interests and states in the Gulf. And I would say maybe even Bahrain and Oman would follow suit, maybe Morocco, who knows? There are many states that are being mentioned in that regard. But I have to tell you that this is kind of a new Arab diplomacy, in my opinion. Basically, what we got here is kind of, as I said before, wide common denominator when it comes to the common economy, when it comes to intelligence, security, agriculture, water industry, everything. So basically, we are in a different Middle East where Israel has become a fait accompli for many Arab states. And as Meir said, this serves to further isolate Iran and put those rivals, or Iran and Turkey maybe in a way, of course, Hamas and Hezbollah, with the those horrible scenes of the port of Beirut and Lebanon, actually with many, many questions to be raised and asked, who is going to march toward the 21st century and what our future is. So I think as kind of a concluding statement, this is a very, very important development. And I do hope that the future will prove that from here on, there would be some other positive developments in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you, Uzi. And we'll, of course, come back to you. Tamar?
Okay, hi. So
Hi.
I'm on. Okay, so again, I'll echo my colleagues' appreciation of this opportunity to discuss these really exciting, extremely current events. And I'd like to I'll go back to what I think Meir said about the really paradigmatic change for the Arab states regarding their relations with Israel, where we're establishing relations with Israel is not crisis related. It's not after losing a war, or it's not reflecting a deep economic crisis, but rather, as it seems to be, based on deep interests, on complementary economics, on geopolitical factors, rather than the circumstances which brought Jordan and Egypt to the table to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. So focusing on these interests is really like a bottom up. It's a different way of looking at these established at this ongoing establishment, what's going to be unfolded in the next couple of weeks and months. And so I'm leaving sort of Iran and the Palestinians on the side, and I'm just going to focus in during my talk on these interests, because I think they lead to a really fascinating frame of analysis. Relations based on interests, diplomatic relations, formal relations with and without normalization. Israel has a peace agreement with Egypt and Jordan and full diplomatic relations, but normalization is obviously lacking. And I think that through the focus on the interests that seem to be extremely apparent with the Emirates, maybe we can learn something, about the gap here between relations and normalcy or normalization. And so there's with the Emirates, we actually don't know what level of diplomatic relations are going to be established. There's a range of possibilities between cooperation, communication, and some formal and full formal relations. But normalization is really an expression of societal interests and of legitimacy. And that looks like it might be a whole different story from what Israel knows with its other peace partners. So with the Emirates, we really see a convergence, and I think that all of my colleagues spoke about this sort of convergence of strategic interests, economic goals. Those were less stressed. And other factors which really bring or explain this exciting development is really this past decade have really made it clear that the era of oil dependency is coming to an end, and climate change is very extreme. So when the Emirates looked left and right and they see who their neighbors are and where they want to go, it seems like it's pretty understandable how Israel could be really a strategic partner in plotting a future that will give an answer to these developing needs, whether it's through technology, medicine, renewable energy, irrigation, security. So this convergence of economic and strategic interest is really striking, and it looks like it's without the baggage of the Palestinian issue. So really, I mean, I'll be careful with how I'm wording this. With Egypt and Jordan, the treaties were based on the assumption of progress on the Palestinian front. Camp David in 1979, Oslo in 1994, and the sort of formal relations without normalization express a disappointment that here they went forward and they signed an agreement expecting advance on resolving the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and yet that did not happen, and they were sort of stuck with this agreement, which had its potential, which is why the agreement survived and sustained despite all the obstacles. But the economies are so non-complementary that and the Palestinian issue is so with Jordan especially is inherently linked to the society there. So the peace agreements were really without the normalization. Whereas with the Emirates, we really see how putting as Yossi said, putting the annexation again, the contribution of the Emirates to the Palestinian issue in taking the annexation off the table for the forever, for the foreseeable future. That's a huge contribution to the Palestinian issue. But as Uzi said, Israel is not the ultimate enemy, just because the Palestinians insist on this ultimatum, sort of holding Israel and the Arab nations captive to this paradigm. So this, I think, is looking at the three partners together will really be exciting in the future to see what held Israel-Arab relations back with its current peace partners and how they might unfold differently with the Emirates.
Thank you, Tamar. So at this point, we'd like to have a discussion about what you, the four of you have just said. And then once we get started, we'll do some Q&A. So who'd like to just go ahead?
Susan, may I have, I would like to ask Yossi something
Yes.
about the role
Of the
please. United States here. And Yossi, I am just coming up with, two explanations I heard from my Emirati friends as to the role of the United States in all that. One of them told me 5 or 6 years ago that since the United States is that important and imperative for the future survival of the United Arab Emirates, they should find actually kind of a way to connect themselves with Israel, as if to say that the best way to the United States goes through Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, which is a nice and old tradition in the Arab world. A second explanation was just heard recently in the streets of Dubai, and I heard that, there are some concern about the American performance after Obama and Trump. And there is kind of an impression that the United States is going to be too hesitant when it comes to Middle Eastern politics. And it is not 100% safe to assume that they are going actually to protect us. So why won't we, two pro-Western and American states, with the same actually issues of concern, we should actually align ourselves in kind of a way by which to minimize the scope of danger which is going to be posed against us even when the United States is going to be out of the region. What is your take about that?
I will say something about the United States because in any case, we talk to our friends in the United States. Something is happening in the United States that you all know. The United States is not a unitary player in the international arena as it's supposed to be. It has tremendous politics embedded in its positions. There is a tremendous shift from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. And there may be a shift from the Trump administration if Biden is elected. What does it mean? I think that Mayor put this point on the narrative, and you too, Uzi, about this Middle East affair, sort of like the Palestinian at the epicenter of the conflict in the region. This came to the fore time and again in the United States. It came, if you remember, after the first Gulf War, when they thought there should be a link between Kuwait and the Palestinian issue. It came after the Second Intifada and the beginning, and after September 11, when even Bush's son thought that if we can only disentangle the Palestinian issue, all other things will come into play. It went away because of the mayhem that shook the Middle East in various ways. The Obama administration also thought that we should put a daylight between us and Israel. And then, of course, during the Arab Spring, the Arabs perhaps will come to the fore with their democracy, and Israel will not spoil the kumbaya society that will evolve in the Middle East. And of course, this issue of the Palestinian was always the language of the Democrats, let alone the language of the progressive in the United States, which became always associated with their very struggle in the United States, including today, of Black Lives Matters, of what they call social justice. Regardless of what is really the difference, but the language has been embedded in it and sometimes completely manipulated, notwithstanding the fact that this is a completely different issue in the Middle East. The Trump administration took a different route. The different route was, we're going to address our ally Israel first and foremost. Israel is our ally. And we are going to be with you from day one. We're not going to be apologetic about it. Secondly, the Trump administration also said to the Arab states, we're not anticipating you any democratic shifts that the Obama administration had in mind, or the cultural shift that they had in mind about democracy. We built alliances in the Middle East, of course, in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, and all of it against Iran. Iran is the nemesis. We're not going to sign a deal with Iran. That was the big issue of the Trump administration. And on the top of it, we will come with the magical formula for solving this conflict. And that was the 2-year formula that was evolving in the Middle East, what they call the plan of the century. The plan of the century was supposed to be here. We put on the table a realistic plan. Israel can never give up the entire West Bank. Israel will stay in large parts of the West Bank, but will have to give up to the Palestinians. The Palestinians will have to go with this program, because no longer with this kind of like rhetoric about heightened revolutionary rhetoric that Israel go away. We're not going to hear it anymore. And we have allies, as both of you have described, and all of you have described, in fact, including Tamar, that this is the new Middle East. The United States, of course, as we say right now, is also in the midst of kind of a shift. We don't know where the shift is going. I don't want to say anything about politics in America, but let's assume that the same language is now becoming again interjected into the language of the Democrats as you see it. This is the language which is prevailing in the Democrats. It is completely disconnected from the reality of the Middle East. And that's my warning. It's completely disconnected from the reality of the Middle East. Has nothing to do with what is happening here. The Americans, the Palestinians always used to say that Americans are too much friends of Israel and so on and so forth. Now they are relying on the American sort of like Democrats and progressive to save them from the Arabs. That's the very interesting case. They want them to save them from the needs of the Arabs. I think this is something which I guess we will see what will happen next. That's why when I made my original remarks, I said, there is here what we call a 3-level game, or like Putnam had a 2-level game, domestic. We have almost a 3-level game here. We have domestic affairs, we have domestic affairs in America, and we have all those conspiratorial theories about the Jews in America also. But these conspiratorial theories are also in decline. The very idea of the Jews controlling this foreign policy is no longer there, let alone, of course, that many of the progressives are in America on the Jewish sort of like votes and so on. I don't want to take more, but I think this is a completely different story. The Middle East has moved. It has moved also from this rivalry in America. America, I don't want to give you any lectures about America. These are American friends, but certainly America has a lot of discussion internally how to put America in order. The diversion to the Middle East is always a diversion, and it's unclear what is at stake for the Middle East in America. It's no longer just oil, it's geopolitics in a different fashion, and it's completely different story for America vis-a-vis the Middle East, and the Middle East vis-a-vis America. Thank you.
Great. Maybe I'll, Meir and Tamar, I mean, I would like to have your observation about something that I was amazed by when I was listening yesterday to many Emirati commentators and even Garagash, which is the foreign minister there. I mean, the impression is, I mean, you don't have to be very smart actually to conclude that on the one hand, Hamas is out of the picture. I mean, they view Hamas as a terrorist group, point. But when it comes to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, I got the impression that it's as if they would like to drive a wedge between the Palestinian public and the leadership. They are sniping at Abu Mazen and company, and they say that they are the main problem for Palestinian not materializing a lot of stuff they could have if their policy was different. And in not so many words, one can conclude that Emiratis would like to see kind of a different government. I don't know how influential they are, but names like Mahmoud Dahlan and others were heard there. What is your take about that? I mean, how this thing actually could be there? By the way, they do offer the negotiation. They would like to have Palestinian state in the end of the day because they think Palestinians should have that. But they warn Palestinians that if that leadership is going to stay on, they're gonna end with nothing. So this is something which is very harsh comment coming from the Emiratis. And I would like actually to have your comment about that, Meir or Tamar.
So actually, what you say brings to mind the famous quote from the Prime Minister of India, Vaipaji, where he says, "You can choose your friends, but not your neighbors." So it looks like the United States is not alone in trying to fix the Middle East. And the Emiratis have their own vision on internal Palestinian politics, and not only on Israeli-Palestinian relations, but also on internal Palestinian politics. And clearly there's a crisis between the Palestinians and the Emiratis. It's been going on for a while. I understand even during the Corona period, they refused to accept direct transfer of money. And there are Palestinians who are closer, you mentioned, to the Emiratis. At the moment, it looks like the Palestinian street is not is behind Mahmoud Abbas. That's how it seems to me. And in his criticism of the Emiratis advancing towards Israel, I don't see that within. I mean, it's been a very short time, so there hasn't been a lot of time to really listen to all the voices. But it seems like maybe things will change. But the Palestinians at the moment seem to be speaking in one voice against this agreement, and there don't seem to be other Palestinian voices that are closer to the Emiratis who are going down a different road, even though the Emiratis would like to see that.
Let me add one more word. I agree with Tamar that the Palestinians are probably now, regarding this issue, are behind the Mahmoud Abbas and against the Emiratis. But I think we can also look at it in a different way, about a generational difference. If you look at the Emirati leadership and the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, this is the new generation of Arab leaders. Younger people who I think understand the importance of the centrality of economics. You mentioned global warming, you mentioned the end of the oil era. These are leaders who understand these processes. The Palestinian leadership is old. It is still prison of its own political slogans of the past, where nationalism was more important than economics, where ideology in this regard was more important than long-term development. This is a tragedy of the Palestinians, that they don't understand that the leadership has missed the bus here. And I think this may be one more reason for the growing gap between the Palestinians and the Emiratis. Here, the Emiratis are looking to the future. I think the Palestinians are still caught too much in the past. And this is why we may see this gap. Now, there's also another point here, which I just, to add to the things that have been said, you look at the bigger picture, there's a very interesting phenomenon here of what's happening is the continued, I would say, decline of the Arab world as a system, the rise of the non-Arab players, the Iranians, the Turks, and the Israelis. Ironically, our weakness and fear of the two Muslim non-Arab powers, that is Turkey and Iran, has pushed some of them toward Israel. And this is an irony of history to imagine this could have happened 10 or 15 years ago. But it's another manifestation of the very poor state of the Arab world as a collective, on the one hand, but also I would say here of a vision of a new generation of Arab leaders. Now, by the way, not all young Arab leaders have great success.
Yeah.
Bashar al-Assad is young biologically, but belongs to a different generation. And King Abdullah of Jordan and King Mohammed VI of Morocco, unfortunately, are too weak to, I would say, make some of the, pursue the same kind of vision which the Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, and to a similar extent, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia are capable of doing.
I think these are very important notes about sort of generational gaps and transformation. There's another transformation that my colleagues are very much aware of, is this sort of like, I don't know if the complete decline, but really the gradual decline of Islamic politics in the Middle East. That is that even though Iran is still playing a very important role, and Hezbollah is an important role, and Hamas with the Islamic ideology, but the Arab sort of like states are moving away from Islamic extremism because they see in Islamic extremism the danger. I had discussion, as Uzi know, with Pakistan this week. And they are also understanding that this Islamic extremism, which was informing us throughout the first decade at least of the 20th century, if not more, is now being seen by Arab traditional regimes, by the traditionalist regime, as a danger. They are modernist in their orientation. They are modernist not in terms of democracy, but in terms of the other issues that you spoke about, environment, economics, etc., but modernist also in terms of the danger that Islamic regimes can inflict on them or endanger their existence in terms of moving forward. So these are the new languages which are now moving in kind of like a collusion. And it's not only a generational gap, because the leadership in Gaza is still kind of a younger generation, but it's a younger generation that is caught in the in the Muslim radicalism, which is now, I think, I don't know if it's dissipating, but certainly being weakened in a tremendous fashion.
If I could add one sentence to what Yossi said.
Please.
For years, Islamists have raised the slogan, Islam is the solution. The so-called Arab Spring has shown that Islam is not the solution.
Absolutely.
The radical Islam is a source of a problem, and it is a disaster. Islamism has failed in every place they try to implement their ideology. It has brought agony to every place where it was able to dominate. And I think that I fully agree. Some Arab leaders now fully understand the danger, and possibly also we can see it in the local level, in the lower, among the people, when people shy away from organizations like Hezbollah on the one hand, or ISIS, because they realize that they have brought only pain instead of providing a solution.
Great. And if I may, Susan, just a concluding note for our discussion. I mean, this is the real impression you get while following actually this guy who is English is being portrayed or depicted as MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, actually the acting ruler in the United Arab Emirates, less ideological, much more flexible in the terms of maximizing your abilities and limitations, and the know-how of how to calibrate kind of a policy that would adjust the changing circumstances. And I fully agree, it has to do, at least in the Gulf, with this generational thing. and we'll wait and see. But this is something that is very promising, and I hope, and we should hope for the good. Thanks.
Thank you. This is really fabulous. Thank you all. I want to leave some time for questions from the audience. So I'll start, unless anyone has anything else to continue that conversation, I'd like to start asking questions.
Yeah, Susan, okay. I'd like to just say
Please.
one sentence. Even though my talk was mostly about the interests, I'd like to warn about being blinded by the interests and by the generational gap, as if there's like a new generation of leadership who's more pragmatic and looks at the interests and looks back at history. We know from the history of conflict all over that nationalism and conflict interests trump economics. And so it could be that the distance between Israel and the Emirates, the fact that there's no border, the fact that there's no direct conflict, there was never a war, allows them to be pragmatic and young and to sort of focus on the win-win possibilities, which seem mind-boggling when you really look at them. But I'm not sure that this is an equation for solving the Israel-Palestinian conflict, or for any other, all other Middle East conflicts. This is really something very unique in the constellation of the Middle East.
You're absolutely right.
Thank you, Tamar. So I'm going to go to some questions, and then anyone, unless they specifically ask for someone's comment, it'll be for anyone. So please share how the reaction has been from the Israeli, Palestinian, and the UAE on the street. How do you see the implications for Bibi politically and Trump politically? Who'd like to answer that?
For Trump, I don't know if there is sort of any significant shift. I don't think the streets of America are rejoicing and rising for Trump because of the deal. Maybe in the margin, it kind of like gives Trump kind of the appearance of more of a presidential, because he was so kind of like involved in the Corona crisis now, in the management, and that's why he's going to also have the ceremony in the White House to give the flair of this global player, which he wanted to be from day one as he entered the White House. So I don't know, I cannot read it right now, how much it really changed. For Netanyahu, it certainly diverted attention from the day-to-day riots, or not riots, but demonstration, excuse me, riots, you have riots, we have demonstrations. The demonstrations, you have riots, we have demonstrations, peaceful ones. Demonstrations against Netanyahu and the opposition to Netanyahu, which started to build not only because of the charges against him for corruption, but also because of really very, very problematic management of the Corona crisis. Netanyahu started to lose lots of ground in the political surveys, that he was losing from 40 seats to 30. We didn't still have any kind of like an alternative, but you could see that Netanyahu was losing ground. The coalition government he built was completely unsettled. They were thinking about new elections soon. And this gave him some room to breathe. I don't know how long he will breathe. I don't know what will happen next, because the crisis of the Corona crisis and the unemployment and the decline, the GDP, et cetera, are tremendous here, like in many other countries. But certainly this gave him a little bit of a breather. And again, this is in the making. The Israelis are always happy when there is peace. This captures the imagination of people, and all the time it's in the news. But the streets were not rejoicing. The demonstration continue. Maybe yesterday or 2 days ago were less, but I predict that this will not capture their imagination more if the economy will decline and the unemployment will continue to be as high as it is right now.
In any case, until November, we're gonna have some ceremonies of such agreements being signed, I guess, in the White House or Camp David or whatever. And I'm pretty sure that it won't be only the Emirates, be some other Arab states. I agree with Yossi. I don't know actually to what extent this would be profitable, electorally speaking, for Trump. But I can tell that, in my opinion, it would be very, very useful for Netanyahu.
Yes.
And I don't think that the timing is mere coincidence. I think it was well planned and organized.
Yes.
Thank you. Here's a question from a professor at one of our universities. She asked Professor Shane, could you clarify the important ways in which the US is disconnected from the reality of the Middle East, the Trump administration, and potentially a Democratic administration?
I think that the Democratic administration in the Middle East have suffered from lack of understanding how the Middle East has moved in the last decade. And that came into display during the Obama years, which started, as you remember, in the famous Cairo speech, which was supposed to shift the Middle East into a new arena. The Cairo speech came on the hill of the Iraqi war. It came to shift the idea of a clash of civilization that came after the September 11 and the Bush administration, and they wanted to change the Middle East. This change didn't take place the way they saw it. The Middle East went into mayhem, into revolutions that went sour, into regime change that were not keen to what the Obama administration wanted, in Egypt, in other places, and of course, what happened in the bloody civil war, or whatever you want to call it, minority wars in Syria, that really blemished the American position morally and otherwise. And of course, the rise of ISIS. The Trump administration was building on that to show the failure of the Obama administration foreign policy and tried to build alliances. And it tried to build alliances with the Arab moderate state, what they call, and with Israel. Now the question is, which is the strategy that the next administration will come? If it's the Democrats and they continue to uphold the language of the 1990s or the anti-Trump administration language, they will go into chaotic situation again. I hope that Biden understands it. If it's Trump, they went, and of course I didn't mention the component of the American deal with Iran, which is a critical issue that Mayor can speak about more. But the question will be, who is coming next? Whether they understand this kind of like a new direction in the Middle East, and trying to be involved, but not really swamped by the Middle East. The Middle East is not as important as it used to be in terms of strategic planning. And that is what I meant by the American short-sightedness about the Middle East, and the warning to the Democrats not to adopt language and policies which are completely disconnected with what is happening on the ground here.
And a short note, if I may, about that. You know, while teaching Middle Eastern history in the 19th century and 20th century, Western presence in this region was a pillar. What we got now is kind of a tumultuous change, with Russia and China coming into the fore, United States, as we said before, much more hesitant. And this is a totally different setting by which actually to understand Middle Eastern actually geopolitics and the way players in the Middle East do understand or grasp what foreign involvement or intervention is. So I guess that this is kind of a real change when it comes to superpowers, Middle East relationships, and this is something that has to be reckoned with when it comes to both the players in the Middle East and superpowers.
Okay, so another question is, which Arab states will join the UAE next in line for a treaty? And does this make it easier for other Arab and Islamic countries like Indonesia to reach out to Israel?
Well, I can say that the talk of the day, and this is kind of a common understanding or conventional wisdom in the Gulf and the Arab world, actually, at some quarters, that next in line would be Bahrain. We'll wait and see, of course. But having said that, we should know Bahrain is a strict follower of Saudi Arabia, which is in the picture. The Saudis are not going to fully normalize relations with Israel because this is a very religious state and there is a history here. But the other state that can be taken into account is the Sultanate of Oman, that used to have some relationship, diplomatic relations actually with Israel, not full relations, but partially. On the other hand, the other two states that are being mentioned are coming from the other side of the region. The first of which is Sudan, where actually some contacts with Israeli statesmen actually behind the scenes were taken 2 months ago. And the last state actually to be thought of is Morocco. But we shall wait and see, because I mean, all these states, as I said, as I think, most of them jump to the conclusion that the agenda or the dogma of the past is so different from the dogma of the day. And Israel, as I said before, should be taken as a lever with which to talk and cooperate in order to better my politics of survival.
Okay, well, first of all, I just wanted to say, one of our audience members pointed out that we don't have riots, we have protests. So there you go. And oh, you're on mute, Yossi.
I said I would never want to argue with your viewers. You have both.
Okay.
My stepkids are in Chicago, and I can tell you have both.
You know
have
what?
riots, yes, and I but as someone who spent many years in America, you certainly have protests, but you have riots as well.
Yes, actually, my daughter's in Chicago as well, and that certainly was a riot. That
Absolutely.
The
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just finding the next question. Oh, are Israelis lining up to vacation in Dubai?
Sorry, Israelis what?
Are Israelis lining up to vacation in Dubai?
Well, I can tell you that what Yossi said about diverting the agenda or the talk of the day in Israel, this is something you can see even when it comes to the televised programs, and the talk of many people is to what extent actually we can have this vacation in Dubai. People are fascinated by these, luxuries of both Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And I think that Netanyahu knew how to portray it in order actually to make many Israelis develop their imagination about that. I don't think that that could neglect or that could just marginalize the very deep problems we have here in economy, society, Corona, and some other stuff. But I guess that many Israelis are really, and this is what I get in the streets and in the workplace. Many people ask me actually, how feasible is that? When we can do that? Is it really actually that thing? And I can tell that, I mean, from having been there and having known actually the, let us say, the popular culture in Israel, this is something that Israel are going to be fond of. Actually, what Dubai and Abu Dhabi have to offer. I know that. But we'll wait and see. Actually, I guess that in the post-corona days, we'll be much more wiser about that.
Thank you. We have so many questions here. Is it okay if we go another few minutes, professors?
Sure.
So another audience member asks, if the UAE opens an embassy in Israel, do you think it will be in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv?
No, they declared it would be in Tel Aviv.
Tel Aviv, no question about it.
Great, that's an easy one. If Joe Biden wins the election in November, could we anticipate another deal made with Iran, despite it being a common enemy of Arab countries?
Well, maybe I'll let Yossi actually to deal with it, but I can tell you that the leadership of the UAE would really like to see 4 more years of Trump, because what you just mentioned has become their nightmare. This is something by which to strengthen Iran, and it goes without saying that that would be against that.
I would like to hear Mayor maybe.
Yeah, if I can add a word here. Unfortunately, I think that the picture with Iran is much less pleasant than is perceived. Trump's policy so far has not succeeded. I mean, if the idea was that Iran would somehow break, and make concessions on the nuclear deal, it has failed. The Iranians steadfasted, they refused to make any deal. The Iranians are building on the idea that the US is isolated. We should not ignore what has happened in the Security Council this week. The US was totally isolated, even by its own allies. Here the Iranians enjoy, unfortunately, almost global support for their point, because like it or not, they stood up to the deal. It was the US which left the deal. So now the US are in a most strong position, especially, by the way, when now various parts of the deal are turning in their favor, the end of the weapons embargo and so on. The Iranians will not, I doubt very much that the Iranians will negotiate a new deal. They may go back to the deal, because we have to look at the fact that right now Iran has moved forward in its nuclear efforts, and it is in a more advanced position today than it had been in 2015. That is, American policy has not succeeded in turning Iran backward, and in fact, Iran has moved forward. The Iranians are now in a better position to renegotiate either continuation of the previous agreement or a new agreement. I have to say that I don't know if Biden can offer them any new, miraculous agreement or not. I'm not saying that the Iranians will move all the way toward the bomb. I don't know. I'm not sure they want it. But the nuclear issue, Trump has not succeeded, and the United States is finding itself in a more difficult position vis-a-vis Iran will find itself after the American elections. I hope I'm totally wrong here, but I'm not sure that I'm wrong.
Well, let's hope that the protests in Iran will,
that's a different issue.
Will be developed into kind of a regime change, which is,
hopefully,
far dream. But I agree with you. Yeah, it's a real problem. And this is, by the way, what makes UAE and other Gulfians so anxious, because they understand what you just said, Meir, and they are very, very concerned about that. Yep.
Thank you. So at this point, would anyone like to have any closing remarks before we end our program? And also, thank you so much. What an honor to have such a prestigious panel. And again, we look forward to hosting you in San Diego one day and maybe doing this again soon. So thank you. And any closing remarks?
So Susan, let us thank you for
Tamar,
making that happen.
the
Thank you.
opportunity.
Tamar.
the pleasure was ours.
Yes.
The
It was a
pleasure is to
pleasure.
be ours.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you to the hosts. Thank you for the initiative. And thank you for our wonderful audience who really spend their morning, their mid-morning with us, discussing these exciting prospects that are developing as we speak. I hope that we'll hear good news from this front. And I'm sure that in any case, it'll be extremely interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know that you're very far away from the Middle East, but as everybody made it clear here, the United States has a very important role to play, even so much from afar, in terms of like the sense of what is happening in the Middle East. The way the people react in the Middle East is oftentimes to what the Americans seem to be choosing on their own. So your elections or your development internally or everything that's happening in America certainly reverberates in one fashion or another on the Middle East, on the hopes or the fears. All of the above are certainly we are impacted by what you're doing. I don't think California has so much impact because you have a fixed vote, but certainly November, as Uzi said, and all of you understand, is a very important time to see what will happen in the Middle East next.
I think it actually goes both ways, right? The Middle East impact on the United States politics manipulated here in the Middle East.
Yes, so maybe we'll do this again after the election. And I know it's evening there, so Laila Tov, Toda Rabah, and Lihi Trov.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.